Hi, I'm Brian Welby with Aringo, and today we're going to be talking about what you can do as an MBA applicant if your GMAT score is low. Aringo specializes in dealing with MBA applicants in that exact situation. And just before we get started, a little background on myself. I'm a graduate of the Kellogg School of Management and work with applicants for Aringo. So just a bit on the admission process to start. The GMAT, of course, is a key factor, but it's normally about a 20% weight in the admission, depending on the school. Also included in that, in the admission, of course, is your undergraduate GPA, your essays and recommendations, your interview, and your personal history and resume. Now, Aringo created this notion of admission drivers, which are critical factors that influence your admission, and they're based on conversation with admission committees, alumni, students, and analysis of past trends and application results. And examples of this would include things like leadership, communication, persuasion, teamwork, etc. Now, the requirements that I mentioned up front, of course, influence those admission drivers, and in particular, your GMAT score influences the analytical skills admission driver, which is used, and the GMAT is really used as a proxy for your academic performance in business school, as well as to an extent a proxy for your professional potential. Key takeaway from today's discussion is that if you have a low GMAT score, all is not lost. You still have a shot to be admitted into a top program. To do that, you're going to need to provide additional context with content in your application with respect to your intellectual capacity to be able to improve on the analytical skills admission driver and also hit upon a well-rounded application. Just a little bit of background on the GMAT itself. You know, these days the average GMAT of admitted students into top programs is measurably above 700, and you'd really like to be in any particular school within the middle 80% band of matriculating students and your GMAT score to have a reasonable chance of admission. But a strong overall application can overcome a weak GMAT, and case in point, if you look at Aringo.com, there's many examples of students listed who had low GMAT scores that were admitted into the top programs. So our main framework for today's discussion, in terms of what you can do with a low GMAT score, we have three proposed areas for candidates to address. The first is to frame your intellectual aptitude with other objective measures. The second is to frame your academic experience as more rigorous than that of your peer group. And the third are actions that the applicant you can take prior to submitting your application itself. So the first of the three areas in our framework in terms of talking about your intellectual aptitude with other objective measures, what you want to try to do here is provide context, typically as a percentile or rank within your peer group, and try to provide more recent results in your academic and professional history wherever possible. So the examples I'm going to talk about are in reverse chronological order for a potential career that might be relevant to you. So things that you might want to highlight would include topics such as, were you selected to train colleagues at work or in a client setting based on your mastery of a subject? If you recently completed the professional certification in your area, like the PE professional engineer, were you selected into your firm based largely on case interview process or problem solving analysis, or was your firm particularly selective overall? Did you recently complete a professional exam where passing would allow you to practice in your region, for example, the bar exam? Other graduate school admission tests like the MCAT or the LSAT. Were you selected for merit-based scholarships, fellowships, or awards, or things like nominated as a top student by your faculty in school, or were you selected to complete research with a faculty member? College entrance exams, your IQ score, high school rank, and even if you skipped a grade, those are some of the things earlier on in your career that you can highlight. Okay, the second part of our framework is talking about your academic experience as more rigorous than that of your peer group, and these are really hardships or complexities that forced you to manage your time in a way that others in your peer group did not face, and again, quantify to the extent possible, and I'll talk a little bit more about that as we get into specifics. So for instance, in school, if you had an above average extracurricular load or significant work experience while in school, definitely provide the hours per week that you were involved, and really only stress this area significantly if you were way above average relative to your peer group. Examples specifically could include things like if you started a business venture, talk about the background there, the lessons learned, how you spawned the idea, etc. If you work full-time or part-time significantly, say 20 plus hours per week, and again, that's that much more impressive when fewer of your colleagues were in that same situation, or military service if you completed that while in school, that's a significant responsibility as well in addition to school. While in school, if you had a more challenging academic setting, you can frame that in one of the following ways if true. If you graduated early, and first of all, talk about that and elaborate why. Usually it's because you were either trying to pay back loans faster or you were afforded a great professional opportunity. If you had a double major, which by definition meant that you had a heavier academic workload in terms of average number of credits per term, and if you had a major that was considered among the hardest at your school. Be careful with that last example though. Admission committees already take into account to an extent what your major was, and they know, for example, that engineering is a demanding major at most schools. When you describe these circumstances that we've talked about so far in the first two parts of our framework, you do not want to come off as though you're complaining about your situation. Instead, you want to try to frame it in a factual, sort of positive way, with the lesson of, hey, this is what I took away from this experience, and this is why it benefited me. So for example, if you had a lot of work experience in school, that might have improved your time management skills, for instance. So now in the first two parts of the framework, we've talked about a lot of ideas. How do you actually place these insights and implement them within your application itself? We believe that it's better to mention these inside your regular essays and CV instead of the optional essay for your application. The art, though, is to come off so that it's not forced into the story in your essays, but rather it's part more of a natural flow. Now, why do we say that you'd like to place them in your regular essays? Well, if you place it in the optional essay, it may appear that you're bringing excuses to the table when you don't want to actually do that. Mentioning the accomplishment that sort of belongs to the topic, so to speak, could actually have a bigger impact on the reader from the standpoint that it's easier for them to remember facts that are part of a coherent flow as opposed to something separate from the rest of the application. So how do you actually place these in the essay, whether it's in the regular or the optional essays? In the regular essays, if it's talking about, or if you're talking about, for example, your background as an applicant, you could say something to the effect of, my childhood shaped the way who I am today, and then somewhere in that essay talk about your high school distinction or SAT scores, if that was relevant and specific to you and your situation. Or if you're talking about your career progression, for example, you could say, one of the key decisions in my career in life was thinking about whether or not to pursue business or a law degree. My LSAT score placed me in the top 10% of students, but I ended up taking a job in the high-tech industry because of my interest in the company that offered me, for example. Within the optional essay, you don't want to just state whatever the contextual factors are. Instead, take a step back and give an introductory sentence like, I believe my GMAT does not accurately reflect my analytical skills, or I'd like to bring a few facts to the admission committee's attention that might help in evaluating these skills. And then you succinctly go and describe the facts. The longer, frankly, that it takes you to explain, the more that it may look like you're bringing excuses to the table. So try to do it in a succinct way. Okay, so the third part of our framework is our actions that you as an applicant can take prior to actually submitting your application itself. Thus far we've talked about things that are basically descriptive of your history. You really can't change them in the first two parts of our discussion. So this third part is really about being strategic in your planning, in how you select schools, and how you complete a well thought out application that will hopefully differentiate you. So some specific examples would include things like the following. First, completing and excelling in getting at least a B, if not hopefully an A, in a business-related course. This is going to somewhat improve the impression of the admission committee on your analytical skills, but it's not totally going to address a low GMAT score. This is particularly relevant if your GMAT quant score is weak, or if you had an undergraduate major that was in a non-technical field or non-quantitative field like the humanities, for example. Obviously, make sure that your grade is available when you apply to business schools, and take or consider taking a class in statistics, finance, or accounting, because these are all classes that you would take in the first year of an MBA program. And finally, try to take the class to the extent that you can at an accredited and prestigious school, or the most prestigious school that you can afford and have access to where you live. Second concept would be to actually retake the GMAT test itself. You're going to only want to do this though if you think that you can improve your score significantly, for example 30-40 points, or if you can get into the 700s, for example if you were just going from 690 to 700, having that 7 in front of your score. In our prior research shows that has a positive effect. Look at your practice test history to see where your scores were at relative to what your previous actual GMAT scores were. Keep in mind that you might not actually improve very much, and you may actually do worse in subsequent tests. And finally, don't retake the GMAT if it's going to distract you from the rest of your applications if you're in the fall and into the application season. With your recommenders' stories and what they talk about in their application for you, in your resume, during your interviews, in your essays, all that combined, if you've got a low quant split on GMAT and or if you've got a non-technical background, think about telling a higher proportion of stories in those areas that I gave that are linked to you mastering a subject, or talking about your analytical skills and problem solving, or you getting up to speed on a complex issue. Conversely, if you've got a low verbal GMAT score, and or especially if you've got a technical background, think about talking about a higher proportion of stories that are linked to you and your leadership skills, and your communication, and your presentation, and your persuasion. And the idea here is that you really want to try to overcome the biases that admission committee members may already have about you, given your GMAT score and your academic and your work history. Another concept. Don't just research the school. Go beyond researching the school and develop relationships to prove interest, to prove that sincere interest. You can develop meaningful alumni and student relationships, and hopefully you'd want to try to do that in a way that is with people who have multiple similarities in terms of your background. That'll be easier to build rapport that way, both ways, because these people could become and can become champions for your advocacy. And they can help to some extent with your chances. Aringo's developed some expertise and guidelines for applicants and how to navigate this process. And as a separate point within this overall idea, mentioning these relationships and what you discussed in the communications within and inside your essays can help to convince schools that you do have a sincere interest in their program and help your chances. From a career goals standpoint in your essays and any application overall, you want to be articulating goals for a career that are specific, that are realistic, that are exciting, and that are differentiated. You want to hit on all of those. Many MBA applicants are career switchers, and they talk about exciting career goals, and that's perfectly fine, and it's frankly expected. The challenge, though, and a common mistake that we see with a number of applicants is that if you list exciting goals but you don't provide enough specifics, or if you don't provide a logical link to the past, it's hard for the committee to believe that you've thought through this enough and that it's a believable, realistic shot for your career. So instead, consider plans that you're interested in and write about career plans that do have some connection with your past, whether it's industry or function or skills that you might bring to the table that are relevant for that career field. For the admission committee to make that, and for them to be thinking that's more realistic for you. Be specific. Talk about specific companies, specific industries and sub-industries, geographies and functions that you've, based on your research, that would describe why it's a fit with you and your background. From a strategy standpoint in picking schools and where to apply, target schools to the extent possible that have a relatively small percentage or proportion of applicants where the background or characteristics of applicants is similar to you. And choose a mix of schools that are across the rankings that you would still consider attending. For example, if you're an engineer and you've got a low GMAT score and you're looking to apply to MIT Sloan, which has a very high number of engineering applicants relative to the number of spots, it's going to be difficult, not impossible, but difficult for you to get admission because it's going to be harder for you to differentiate yourself with that low GMAT score. So therefore, research the demographic and geographic and industry makeup of schools and their classes to understand where you may have an opportunity. Now, we're not saying to give up on a dream school or a set of dream schools, but just apply or consider applying across a reasonable range of rankings of schools that you consider attending to give you an improved admission shot. Again, on the selecting and targeting schools topic, go ahead and try to target schools if you can, if you've got a low GMAT, that place relatively low or lower weight on the GMAT itself. Now you might be asking, well, that's great, but what are those schools that have that lower weight? On Aringo.com, you can find out how much importance each admission driver of the multitude of admission drivers has on each program, for example, on the analytical skills or communication. And you'll also find application tips for each program. Just within Aringo.com, you'll want to click on the Top Programs button to find some of that information. A few closing remarks. Obviously, every applicant and his or her story is unique. Focus on the key issues that are most relevant to you, your background, your history, and your story. Today, to deal with a low GMAT score, we've talked about additional intellectual accomplishments and undergraduate context that you can provide, along with this notion of providing superior essays and recommendations and interviews done in a strategic way in your application. To provide further information if you're interested, or to discuss your admission chances with an Aringo expert who's got a background similar to you, please contact us at Aringo.com. I want to thank you very much for watching today, and best of luck with your applications.
Hello, I'm Brian Welby with Aringo, and today we're going to be talking about what you can do as an MBA applicant if your GMAT score is relatively low. Aringo specializes in dealing with applicants with low GMAT scores, and you can read through more about the information on the firm at Aringo.com. Just a bit of background about me before we get started. I'm a graduate of the Kellogg School of Management and work with MBA applicants for Aringo. So let's talk a little bit first about the admissions overview and requirements. So obviously there's the GMAT, which Aringo research indicates is normally about a 20% weight in the total decision, depending of course on the school. Other requirements include your undergraduate GPA, your essays, the recommendations, your interview, and your personal history and CV. Now, Aringo has created the notion of admission drivers, which are critical factors that influence admission and were developed based on conversation with admission committees, students, and alumni, conclusions based on prior year results, trend evaluation, and press research. And these admission drivers include things like leadership skills, teamwork, initiative, persuasion, analytical skills, etc. And each of the requirements that I mentioned as part of the admission process in turn influences one or more of the admission drivers. In particular, the GMAT influences the analytical skills admission driver, as it's a proxy for how well the applicant will perform academically and to some extent professionally. The key takeaway from today's discussion is the following. If you have a low GMAT score, all is not lost. You still have a shot at being accepted into a top program. However, to be successful, you need to provide appropriate context for your low GMAT score with other content that can describe and discuss your intellectual capacity to improve on the analytical skills admission driver. And importantly, you also need to deliver a well-rounded application to influence the many other admission drivers. Just a bit about the GMAT. The average GMAT of students admitted into virtually all top programs is now measurably above 700, and you'd really like to have a GMAT score that's comfortably within the middle 80% range of matriculating students at a given school to have a reasonable admission chance. But again, a strong overall application can overcome a weak GMAT score, and a great case in point, on Aringo.com, you can see many examples of students listed with low GMAT scores who were admitted into the best schools. So what can you do if your GMAT score is low? There's three proposed areas that candidates can address. The first is framing your intellectual aptitude with other objective measures. The second is framing your academic experience as more rigorous than your peer group. And the third are actual activities and actions that the applicant can take prior to submitting and in the application itself. So the first idea in our framework is again, framing your intellectual aptitude with other objective measures. You want to always provide context here, typically as a percentile or a rank out of the total of your peer group, and you want to give priority to statistics that have more recent results. So some examples could include college entrance exam scores like an SAT or an ACT, IQ scores, graduate school admission results besides the GMAT, like an LSAT or an MCAT. Professional exams where passing allowed you to practice, like the bar exam in the United States. Your high school rank or placement, selection for merit-based scholarships or fellowships, or things like being nominated by the faculty in your department for the top student or selected to complete research. Other ideas to frame your intellectual aptitude. You skipped grades while growing up in school because you were part of a gifted program. You were selected to train colleagues at work or in a client engagement because of your mastery of a subject. Maybe you completed professional certifications like PE to professional engineer. You were selected into your firm based largely on case interviews or on problem-solving analysis. Or you were selected into a particularly selective firm. All ways to frame your intellectual background. So the second concept in our framework today was talking about ways to frame your academic experience that's in a way that was more rigorous than your peer group. And here we're talking about hardships or complexities that force you to manage your time in a way that most others did not. And again, quantify. So some examples here. You completed school with an above average extracurricular workload, or you had significant work experience while in school. In these cases, definitely provide the number of hours per week involved, and stress this area a lot in your essays or in your application only if it was indeed significantly higher than your peer group. Specifics could include, you started a business venture, and definitely talk about lessons learned in the process for how you developed the idea in the company. If you worked full-time or something like 20 plus hours per week, and it's more impressive when you can frame that in a way that a very small proportion of your peers were involved in that kind of activity or involvement. If you completed military service, definitely talk about that as well. That's a major commitment. Another idea would be if you completed school in a more, let's call it, quote unquote, challenging academic setting or context versus your peers. And that could include things like if you graduated early because you took a heavier course load. Talk about the driver of that, though. It's probably because either you wanted to pay back loans faster or because you were provided a great professional job opportunity. Another instance of this would be if you graduated with a double major, obviously making your course load heavier. You can also try to talk about the fact that your major was considered very difficult or among the hardest at your school. If you do that, try to definitely back it up with a quote or a fact. But be careful here. Admission committees already take majors into account to some extent. For example, they know that engineering is demanding. On these examples, one final comment. As you describe those circumstances, which we gave examples for, you don't want to appear to be complaining about them. Instead, you want to refer to that situation in a positive, factual way. Talk about what you learned and took away from the experience, how it was beneficial. For instance, if you were working significantly while in school, talk about how that improved your time management and communication skills. So how to place these insights into the essays and where to place them. You got a few ideas, or you have examples, and what to do about them. So where to place, we believe that it's better to place them inside the regular essays for a school and or in your CV instead of placing them in the optional essay section that the schools allow. The art, though, here is that you want to try to plant them in such a way that they don't appear to be forced in any way in part of a story in an essay, but instead want to be part of a natural flow. Why are we articulating this argument in this way? So placement of these comments in the optional essays can potentially appear as if the candidate is bringing excuses to the table, and instead, if placed within the regular essays in an appropriate, flowing way, the reader thinks to himself, wow, this person is smart, they have a great background, it's really interesting, etc. Additionally, mentioning the accomplishment because it sort of belongs to the topic could have a bigger impact on the reader. It's a little bit easier to remember facts that are part of a coherent story and flow compared to those that are separate from the rest of the application. So how do you actually place these comments within the regular essays? If it's an essay describing the applicant background, one comment could be something to the effect of, my childhood and family background shaped who I am today, and thus I believe it could help the committee in evaluating my candidacy. And then within that essay, then go ahead and point out the relevant facts. Another example would be talking about, if if you made a major decision, for example, to pursue a law degree or take your first job, and you got a high LSAT score, place that within that discussion and part of that story. If you place the idea, however, into the optional essays, don't just state the facts as is. Just provide some upfront context, and you can be brief and say something like, hey, I believe my GMAT score does not accurately reflect my analytical capabilities, or something like, I'd like to mention a few facts that might help the committee in assessing my analytical skills, and then go ahead and very succinctly describe the facts, because the longer that it takes for you to explain them, and the more that you're elaborating on them, the more that it may appear to the reader that you're making excuses. So items thus far that we've talked about are really descriptive of your previous history, and you can't change them. The third main item in our framework is going to be actions that you can take prior to submitting or within your MBA application strategy. Really, you need to be strategic and think through your planning and your school selection efforts with a holistic application that differentiates you. And so a few examples of that would include things the following. So the first would be to complete and excel in, get at least a B, if not an A, a business-related course. This is going to somewhat improve the AdCom's impression of you, but it's not going to totally address a low GMAT score. It's especially relevant to do if your GMAT quant split is weak, or if you've got an undergraduate major that was in a non-quantitative field. Obviously, make sure that the grade is available when you apply to business schools, and take a course in statistics, finance, or accounting, since these are core subjects in the first year of an MBA program, and schools recommend one of those three types of topics. If you can, take the course at an accredited university, and at the most prestigious university you have access to and can afford, to make it more credible. Second idea would be retake the GMAT if you believe that you can achieve a higher score and get a significantly improved score. If in practice tests, for example, you've consistently scored much higher than what you got on the physical test, consider retaking. Keep in mind, though, that for many people, the score on subsequent tests will not improve very much and may actually decrease. Really only consider this, though, if it's not going to distract you from successfully completing the rest of your application materials on time. So make a judgment call on time on that. In looking at your recommender stories, what they talk about in your resume, in your MBA interviews, and in your MBA application essays, if you have a low quant split on the GMAT, and especially if you have a non-technical background, tell a higher proportion of stories that are linked to mastering a subject, or solving analytical problems, or getting up to speed on a complex issue. Conversely, if you have a low verbal GMAT split, and especially if you have a technical background, in that case, tell a higher proportion of stories about your leadership, about your communication, about your presentation, persuasion abilities. And the idea here is that you want to try to overcome biases that the admission committees may have about you when they look at your verbal and quant GMAT splits, as well as the bias that they may have in looking at your academic and work history. When you're looking at schools, don't just research the school online or read. Obviously, you need to do that, but really develop relationships and mention those relationships to prove interest. Developing rapport with a couple of alumni or students with whom you've got similarities in background or interest is beneficial, because those people can become champions for your candidacy. And Aringo has developed some expertise in successfully guiding applicants through this process. And schools prefer to admit students who are more likely to attend if they're admitted. And so mentioning these contacts in your essays in a meaningful way helps to convince schools of your interest. In the career goals part of the application, articulate specific, realistic, exciting, and differentiated goals. Many applicants for MBA programs are career switchers. That's expected, and that's okay. However, too many applicants write about very exciting goals, but without providing enough specifics, or without a reasonable logical link to their previous experience. So instead, consider talking about plans that you're interested in that maintain some connection with your past, whether it's industry or function, so they're more realistic and believable. And include specific details about firms, industry, geography, based on research you've done, why you think that job or job profile would fit with your work style and background. When you're targeting schools, target those that have a relatively small or smaller percentage of applicants with your background or characteristics, and choose a mix of schools across the rankings. So, for example, on that first point, if you're an engineer and you have a low GMAT score, getting accepted at MIT Sloan, which has a very high number of engineering applicants, is going to be difficult, and it's therefore harder to differentiate yourself. So research the demographic, geographic, and pre-MBA industry makeup of top schools to understand where your opportunity might be. Now, having said that, you don't have to necessarily give up on a dream school, but do apply to a mix of programs across the range of rankings that you'd consider attending to give yourself an improved shot at admission. And finally, target schools that place a relatively low weight on the GMAT. So you might be asking yourself, well, what are those schools? On Aringo.com, you can find out how much importance or relative importance each program assigns to the different admission drivers. For example, analytical skills, which is based in part on the GMAT. If your GMAT is not high, these kinds of tips are particularly valuable. Just click on the top programs button on Aringo.com. Some closing remarks. Obviously, every applicant's story is unique. Focus on the most relevant key issues impacting your background. Today, to deal with the low GMAT score, we've discussed potential ideas about how to frame additional intellectual accomplishments in your undergraduate context to present to the committee and how to do that. We talked about how applicants realistically need to provide a holistic application, including your essays, recommendations, and the interview in a very strategic way to balance that low GMAT score. To further discuss your admission chances and ideas and tactics with an Aringo expert that matches who has a background similar to yours, please contact us at Aringo.com. Thank you very much for watching, and best of luck with your application.